is not just the responsibility of governments alone. It is a shared imperative and a shared opportunity for the private sector, development partners, and institutional investors. Social infrastructure is investable, and when financed responsibly, it offers not only social returns, but long term, stable financial returns. The task ahead is not just justify why we should invest in systems, but how can we mobilize greater private capital to do so at scale and with impact. As the largest asset manager on the continent, the Public Investment Corporation has led the way. We have made strides in our investments in social infrastructure, having invested 660 million US dollars to date. But we know we cannot do it alone. The scale of need requires collaboration, innovation, and a reimagining of how public and private capital can co invest in stability and long term value. So I urge us today to think boldly, think differently, and to break down the silos between economic and social investment. To not just ask what infrastructure costs, but what it prevents, what it enables, and what it protects. Because when we invest in housing, we invest in safety. When we invest in sanitation, we invest in dignity. And when we invest in education, we invest in possibility. When we invest in healthcare, we invest in life itself. And collectively, when we invest in social infrastructure, we invest in the conditions that make markets work, in the trust, the stability, and the future that capital needs to thrive. Today, I'm honored to share the stage with like minded partners, including the International Finance Corporation and the Council of Europe Development Bank, who are committed to leveraging capital for social good. I'm also privileged to be joined by the Ministry of Finance, the Italian Ministry of Finance, whose insights into the intersection of public and private healthcare investment are invaluable, and our colleagues from the Center for Affordable Housing Finance Africa, whose exceptional research continues to guide smart investment in the sector. I look forward to the panel discussion where my colleagues will share their expertise, insights, and together we'll explore the path forward for financing social infrastructure and building a more resilient, equitable future. However, first, we have a presentation from Yasmina Glashovic. Yasmina is the head of grant operations and new instruments at the Council of Europe Development Bank. Yasmina will be sharing her research on the importance of social infrastructure and the role of multilateral development banks. After Yasmina, we'll have a presentation from Henry Blas. Henry is the program lead from the Global Infrastructure Hub at the World Bank, working under the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the presentation from Yasmina and Henry.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope the presentation is on the screen because I cannot see it, Zanele, if somebody can put it on the screen, but I can start. Anyone putting the presentation up? Oh, there you are. Great. Okay, let me see if this works. Okay, great. Sorry about this. We are ready to start, and it's my pleasure today to present everything basically what the CB does. And this is financing social inclusion, cohesion in Europe since 1956. So as you can see on the slide, the CEB is one of the oldest multilateral development banks, and our mandate is inclusively social inclusion and social infrastructure. So this is why our colleagues from the South African presidency felt that maybe today is the time that we also share what we do at the CB and what the MDBs, multilateral development banks, globally and jointly or independently do in financing social infrastructure. The CB works only in Europe, I have to say, unfortunately, because we would love to have a broader geographical mandate, but most of our member states are basically states of the European Union, but also former Yugoslavia, Turkey, Moldova, and our latest member, new member, is also Ukraine. CB had its origins in the after the Second World War, after the refugees and migrants from the Second World War were resettled. And it was founded as a resettlement fund. And now it's a multilateral development bank with around 36 billion euros in assets. And as you can see on the slide, every year we approve new projects in the value of around 4.5 billion euros. CB priorities are only social. So, as you can hopefully see on this slide, we invest in human capital, meaning in schools, meaning in social care, education, cultural heritage. We are working together with member states to promote inclusive and resilient living environments. And today we will talk specifically about housing, affordable and social housing. And we also work with our member states to support jobs, economic and financial inclusion. And in this context, we also have certain cross-cutting themes that we prioritize, as you can see on the slide, climate change, gender equality, and digitalization. Now, why are we here today? Our focus is in Europe, but this year we've been very closely working with the group called the Heads of MDBs Group, which is basically an informal forum of 10 MDBs leaders working together to strengthen collaboration and impact that they can jointly have. And in 2024, which was a very important moment for the heads of MDB's group, the viewpoint note was issued committing all the 10 LDBs to work better in the system, as a system. And this viewpoint note actually directly informed the G20 roadmap on bigger, better, and more effective MDBs, which was endorsed by the G20 leaders in November 2024. And the CB is here today also because in 2025, CB was sharing this group. Our governor was, Carlo Monticelli was sharing the heads group. And we were prioritizing the implementation of the G20 roadmap, representing the MDBs via the IFAB G20 working group. But we also tried throughout the year to talk about something that we know how to do, and this is social infrastructure. We tried to put it on the spotlight to raise awareness why this type of infrastructure is very, very important, maybe today more than ever. And as a result, the process obviously lasted for several months, but we also have concluded together with the other MDBs a joint document which will be published in 1 month, titled Social Infrastructure in Focus, the Role of MDBs. And we were very pleased that at their June meeting, the heads actually welcomed progress on this work and recognized the role of social infrastructure in basically jobs, productivity, inclusive growth, and encouraged MDB staff from these organizations to work jointly even more than before. Today, we will have several panelists, and they will talk a lot about the role of the private sector also in social infrastructure. But what we wanted to do during this year is to also highlight why is it important to invest in social infra. Because sometimes from perspective of a government, it can be an expense to finance teachers, health. We always say expenses for health, but then when you look at the research, when you look at the data, we clearly see patterns of countries which invest more in human capital, which invest more in human health and we can really see the impact on the economic growth, on obviously creating inclusive societies, but also on GDP and other aspects. What we can see also very clearly, unfortunately, is that there is a big financing gap to meet the SDGs, which are related to some parts, key parts of social infrastructure, such as you can see on the slide, health, education, water, and sustainable cities, which include affordable houses. And a good reminder for all of us was the pandemics, and it was very clearly shown by researchers, by data, that underinvestment in social infra had a very wide economic impact. And countries which were less ready to basically deal with pandemics, they have suffered major economic consequences. The annual gap, which is estimated, as you can see here on the screen, to meet the SDGs that I mentioned above, is really big. It's $800 billion annually. Uh, but what we all need to take away from at least our research and from the experience of more developed countries is that every euro, every dollar spent in social infra is not an expenditure, but on the other hand, it helps improve the productivity, it helps improve resilience, and ultimately growth. I will not go into details of this slide because our colleague Henry will, after this presentation, talk about the investment of G20 governments. But what we wanted to highlight today, and what is a discussion which will probably last for many, many years ahead, is how can we include the private sector more? Because in some countries, in most countries, government financing is not enough, although it's the most important. And as you will see from Henry's presentation, governments are the main financiers funders of social investments and social infra. We need the private sector. And uh, since our topics today are around a few sectors, not all these sectors are basically uh, having the private sector included in the same way. In some cases, some sectors are more attractive, like the housing and water, for obvious reasons, for cash flows, for basically an opportunity to get any return on financing. While in health and education, we do not see globally, obviously, in some countries they're more involved, in some countries less, but globally, health and education are lagging behind. And MDBs, as I will talk about later, are also there to help include the private sector, provide different instruments that can help bring the private sector, and the government's role, as Henry, I hope will also talk about, is to create an environment which can help create the returns of possibility for the private. MDBs are, as we saw in our paper that will be published in 4 weeks, are already supporting many investments in social infra. And we did an analysis to actually calculate how much of the total MDB investments go to the core sectors: health, education, housing, and water and sanitation. And on average, this is about one fifth. We may argue if it's enough, if it's sufficient, but keeping in mind the different mandates of the MDBs and different priorities and different needs, we were positively surprised to see that there is still a significant amount of financing, and not just financing, but also technical support going to social infrastructure projects. And what we see is that MDBs are also leveraging and fundraising in global capital markets to get more financing for social. And since 2016, they have even they were in the lead in creating a specific instrument, and this is also very relevant for the governments, called social bonds, which are a very popular tool. They're very well received by the market. We at the CB, together with colleagues from other MDBs, are one of the lead institutions in basically creating standards, principles for social bonds, and the uptake of the market has been very, very good. But it's not all about financing, it's also about how we support as MDBs, how we support social infrastructure. And these are some main broad areas which we have learned from this work the MDBs basically use. These are different approaches and the ways they prioritize social infrastructure. Most of them, I would say even all of the institutions, have some focus on health education and skills, and they have knowledge them in their new strategies. There was for some a shift after the pandemics, after the COVID pandemics, and some MDBs in Asia, for example, have started after COVID crisis to actually finance, for example, health infrastructure, which was not at all their priority before. Digitalization is a very big theme, it's cross-cutting. For some, they're actually focusing on digital projects, a lot of it in countries, for example, like India or big countries, in this country as well, focusing on digital delivery, on telemedicine, and all the other ways to have uh, patients and people included, if it's not possible physically, through physical infra, then through digital and technology. Climate and resilience and the just transition principles are also an approach that different banks use to finance social infrastructure and to achieve co-benefits between climate and social investments. And I would say that most MDBs, what we saw through this work and what we will be able to read in the paper, are explicitly focusing on an inclusive approach on equity and basically focusing on some vulnerable groups more or less depending on the mandate. We are, as the social bank, using our own tool called availability lens to make sure that nobody's left behind. And there is obviously, as mentioned before, a very strong emphasis on the links between social infra and economic prosperity. And the World Bank Group, as we highlighted here on the slide, puts jobs at the core, but not just the World Bank. We know that in Africa countries, in this country, in many other countries, including youth and youth unemployment or youth employment is a big challenge ahead of us. Some of the instruments and innovations that we are using to attract the private sector, I mentioned before, and we will talk about it more at the end. Uh, but I want to also share with all of you that what we see among the MDBs is that there is more and more joint financing, partnerships, parallel financing, all in order to support, not just by financial instruments, but also by technical assistance, capacity building, and other tools, the countries, and also to attract the private sector. Here we have highlighted some notable examples. There are many more examples. Within the heads of MDBs uh, group, we have a joint co-financing group, basically a portal which also tracks what we do jointly and try to promote that we join forces and create synergies with our investments. But just to highlight a few examples here, we have an excellent project that is done by the African Development Bank and the New Development Bank in this country. We highlighted one of the biggest investments in social infrastructure ever, which is a joint venture partnership of several MDBs, which we noted here on the slide, the Asian Development Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the World Bank, and the Islamic Development Bank to support health sector in Indonesia. African Development Bank in BBRD, for example, joined forces in Tunisia to improve sanitation in many small municipalities across the country, while in Latin America and the Caribbean, the World Bank and the IDB have a very interesting project on digital connectivity for students and teachers. And finally, in Europe, we, the Council of Europe Development Bank and the European Investment Bank, we partner a lot in many projects, and we highlighted one, which is basically co-financing cultural, social, and educational hub in Cyprus. What is the main message for today and before we have this discussion for us? The main message is that social infrastructure, social cohesion, social inclusion in every country ultimately brings more equitable society, inclusive growth, and can have positive impact not just on the social well-being and the well-being of people, but also on the economies of these countries. And I will stop here and now ask our colleague Henry to tell us what are the G20 countries doing and how are they financing social infra. Thank you.
Everyone? Is there sound okay? I don't have the phone. Okay, so my name is Henry Glass. I work with the PF Global Infrastructure Hub. While the slides are sort of being loaded. So PF does a lot of work around sort of enabling environment for infrastructure in emerging markets, in particular around sort of water, but also all the core infrastructure that then supports social infrastructure projects. So here today, what I'm going to do is try and sort of give an overview of what we know about private investment in social infrastructure. Very broadly, all the way from water to health education. We have some numbers on housing, a little bit less, but so we try to basically gather all the evidence that we could find, so that we start from a good point for the discussion. So can we get the slides on? Okay. So the outline, so the way we've gathered the data is very similar to the previous presentation I've made to this group. We basically tried to collect data from all type of providers, public and private, to give you, I guess, the best insight we could find. Not only just G20 country, but really sort of globally, including sort of developed and emerging countries all together. So the outline, I'm just going to go through very quickly on what we know on total spending. I think we need to take a step back before we dive into sort of private investment. And then I'm going to look at the trends for what we're going to call PPI, mostly PPP type of transaction, like private participation in public infrastructure. And I think for when it comes to social infrastructure, that's the big difference from the others. There's a lot, you will see a lot of private investment into private social infrastructure. But I think here we're mostly interested in how we sort of bring the private and the public together. And then last, I'm going to touch on some of the aspects that can sort of enable more of that investment. I'm not going to be able to cover all of them, but I'm going to mainly focus on the MDBs and guarantees. So again, big overview, then the sort of PPP type, and then how we could sort of work together to sort of accelerate more private investment into that social infrastructure. So first, if you look at the total spending, and so those numbers also get different sources, you can see that indeed social infrastructure is quite big. Governments in general spend probably around sort of 4% of their GDP on average into infrastructure, and actually 1% of that, is slightly more, is social infrastructure. So it's quite big. It is not like a small sector. It's a big spend. That number is being pretty flat. So if we go into health and education to start with, the numbers are fairly similar between the two. What's interesting here is that obviously if you look at total spending, could not even fit into one page because it's pretty big. I mean, it's probably 10% more in some places. So the actual spend on social is quite big from a government perspective, and more than 10% of GDP. Now, if we look at the infrastructure as part of that, again, the number is not as good as let's say energy sector. Energy sector will have very much more accurate numbers. When it comes to social, we think that on average probably about 1% of GDP, which is still very significant. As part of that, actually, probably almost half of it. I mean, the data that we have is mostly OECD and a few sort of large emerging economies. So I take those numbers a pinch of salt, but still half of it is private sector. The challenge here is that it's mostly private sector for private audience, if you want. So we're talking about sort of like private university, private clinic. So they're not exactly sort of private or public. If we look at this as a Venn diagram, I think the middle one is unfortunately very small. So private going into public infrastructure is actually probably around less than 0.05 of GDP. So it's very, very, very small. But I think in there what we see is some interesting trends. And again, we all want that pie to that Venn diagram to sort of be a little bit bigger in the middle. Um, Now, if you look at water and sanitation, it's kind of the same story. It's a bit less overall. It's less spent. It's not 10% of GDP, so it's less than that when we look at total spending. The private, we're not too sure because a lot of corporate, a lot of small utilities, so it's very difficult to get the data. It's one of the key data gap that we're trying to sort of work on. When we look at sort of PPP type of transaction, it's the same range, so 0.01% of GDP. So again, fairly small. It is difficult to get private sector to invest in those public. When they do, though, what's the data that we found is that when they do and they actually do own concessions, there's actually a lot of corporate investment that comes after that. Harder to sort of capture, but sometimes we see this as only one transaction. But we have to remember, transaction is just an NPV of the value. Right? After that, the private sector will continue to invest a lot. So I think don't want to sort of make it sound like it's there's no private investment. There is. It's not as big as we would like it to be. When you look at the gap, it's a very interesting report that the World Bank just published this year on assessing the gap in water investment. So in there, you'll see a lot more data. I didn't want to sort of put too much, but you can look at that report for more insight into this. The gap obviously is pretty big. I think we'll need to at least sort of double total investment in water infrastructure to sort of reach the SDG. So again, the gap is big, and at the moment, the private investment is not as big as we would like it to be. So hopefully that gives you like a feel for those sort of two or three sectors together. So now let's look at this sort of small part in the middle of that Venn diagram, and so look at the PPPs, right? What do we see? So unfortunately, what we see, primary markets mostly greenfield type of investment. Secondary markets is more refinancing, acquisition, etc. There's two things here. First, on the left-hand side, what we see is the primary market, so greenfield, has been pretty stable. A bit of increase recently, but really, as a percentage of GDP, it's been pretty stable. So it's there's just the way the market is. If you compare that to other sectors, obviously, we have had less success in sort of getting private sector to invest in that public infrastructure. What we do see on the right, though, when it comes to secondary markets, is that it's not for lack of interest from capital markets or investors. Secondary market basically give us a feel for the sort of liquidity in the markets, how many deals have been made, and some of them might be acquisition. So clearly, there's appetite from the private sector to invest in those concessions or in those projects. It's just not enough project, and I think that's where I think Piaf and others are working in creating better environment so that we actually get more deals out there. In terms of regions, I think what we see here, it's everyone. So it's not only EMDs, it's basically the entire world. We've seen some success, in particular in MENA region, so the Middle East region, mostly on the water sector. So that's been one of the sort of the leading growth area. But overall, as you can see, unfortunately, on the left-hand side, you'll see that Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the numbers are pretty small still, unfortunately. So I think that's where the World Bank and the NMDBs in general are sort of bringing a lot of effort to sort of, at the very least, sort of bring it to the average. There's a lot of potential there, obviously, but at the moment we're not sort of managing to see enough projects that can be sort of bankable and sort of work. In fact, what we're seeing, and it's very similar to sort of total investment in all the other infrastructure sector, is that we see, unfortunately, sort of stabilization or sometimes more than that between sort of high income and EMDs. Unfortunately, investment opportunity still remains mostly in high income countries. In fact, even when we look at EMDs, you can see on the sort of right hand side that when we split EMDs into income levels, actually all those deals that we see are mostly in upper middle income countries, right? What we would like to see is obviously more into the low income, but that's not what we see. We see that in sort of digital energy more, but when it comes to social, it's a challenge. So that's what it is. War is slightly better, but still mostly upper middle income countries. That's where we're seeing those deals. If we look at sort of The subsectors in there, as I say, water remains kind of the one that we see the most across countries. But what's interesting again on the right hand side, coming back to this on secondary market, is that there's definitely appetite. Again, we have to sort of remember that half of social infrastructure investment is private sector. It's not towards public infrastructure per se, but it's still there. And when we look at secondary market, including on social housing, we can see the appetite. Once those deals are out and those corporates are working, actually there's a lot of appetite. It's just like, how do we get more deals into this? Um, and why is it so attractive? Because actually, once it's created, not only do you get a lot of corporate investment following up, but you also get very low default rate. So something that we tend to forget is that those deals are hard to put together, but once they work, they're actually fairly attractive for long-term investors because again, default rates is actually pretty low. The service that it provides is usually sort of very very much required, and so usually it actually works pretty well. Actually, as you can see, social has got the lowest of the default rate across the last 20 years. So again, that shows the appetite from the market, and there's a reason for that. So I'm going to sort of finish a little bit here on some of the factors that could enable more investment in emerging markets. Um, so first of all, when we look at so this is a graph that we use and kind of like looking at it this way is like, okay, we have this private investment, but what are the couples required to make it work, right? And so here, what you can see is that actually, so that's purely emerging markets. This time, so I'm went from global to purely emerging market now. When you look at social, is by far and large the one sector where private sector alone it's actually very difficult for them to sort of make it work. Most of the time, most more than sort of like 60% of the time, is with somebody else. So that's where the role of DFI, state, and I think Jasmina sort of asked me to emphasize on this. As you can see, state and DFI or state plus private is very much something that sort of give investor confidence. So I think it's if we're realistic, at least for the sort of first couple of projects in any country, the role of the DFI and the government will be critical. Then after that, once you have the right model, then maybe you'll be able to scale it. But initially, that's what we see much more than all the other sectors together. Water a bit less actually. We see a lot of sort of private only, but that's mostly sort of concessions, etc. So now, if we deep dive into blended finance, the reason why I'm going to blended finance because we're gonna have a seminar this morning, actually just before lunch, on blended finance. So if we look at subset of blended finance deals, we see kind of like the same picture. This time is not about couples like the amount of equity or debt invested per participant, right? What we see is that actually the MDB, DFI, ECAs in particular as well are very important, especially in places like Africa. That's where you see the roles again of the ZFI to be absolutely critical. Oops, sorry. Um, so that's that, and then what we see as well. I think there's been some issue with the shouldn't look like this. The orange bar should go all the way to the down to the bottom. But here, what's interesting is that it's not just projects. So I think we tend to sort of think of like as mostly projects, but actually we see a lot of sort of bond issuance of corporate investment. So it's sometimes actually making an impact on social infrastructure, maybe through corporate. It's not just like a new project only. In fact, when you look at this, when you look at blended finance, half of those deals that were successful in the social sector were actually non-project. They were sort of corporate, they were facilities, they were bonds. So I think that's interesting to sort of hear from the panel on how this sort of successfully sort of help companies actually getting finance, not only just project and PPPs, right? It's a bit more complex than that. There's more opportunities there as well. One of the aspects that we just talked a lot, and obviously the WOMAC and others putting a lot of effort in sort of bringing more guarantees products into the market, is that what we've seen, at least for the subset of products on blended finance, is that guarantees seem to be pretty effective, in particular in the social sector. So what we're seeing on the left hand side is that once you have guarantees, you actually are able to sort of raise more private commercial debt than if you don't. Right. So basically, the guarantees seem to be a good mechanism to get that commercial debt as opposed to getting a high share of DFI type of debt. So that's pretty important. We also see the same effect across the other sectors, but I think the reason why we highlighted it is that when it comes to social, that seemed to be a fairly good instrument to sort of enable this type of investment. What we're seeing as well is not only on sort of the size of the commercial debt that can be raised, is that the average deal size can also increase significantly. And as we know, sort of, larger deals tend to attract some more investors, and also, I mean, the cost of setting it up, structuring it, can also be lower. So you're getting sort of more impact, hopefully, out of your efforts. So does sort of do those two points on guarantees. I'm not saying here, I want to be clear, that guarantees is the only way, but since we're going to talk about it a little bit this afternoon, it'd be good to hear more from the panel on that as well. So last but not least, I think, so those are instruments that can sort of improve deals. But I think before we go into this, I think enabling environment is critical. As we all know, if we don't have this, you're not going to get infrastructure projects, and you're certainly not going to get social infrastructure projects. So I think while there's not as many deals or as many sort of projects that have been successful as much as we will like anyway, there's still some projects that are very, very interesting. I think one work that we're doing, PF doing, the World Bank, and others, is really sort of scaling up the success stories, right? How do we replicate those projects that work well? So one of the work that we're doing currently with the Singapore government and the Singapore Water Center is to sort of really sort of come up with great case studies that sort of explain exactly how some of the success projects, in that case, particularly in the water sector, how this sort of happened. And I think here the story needs to be complete, like all the work that was required in the environment and the political side, and then looking at sort of projects and sort of the enablers such as guarantees and others. And I think through this, hopefully, we'll sort of manage together to sort of replicate those projects, because it's not simple. But I think once you actually see a few examples that work, I think they can be replicated. So here we're doing it in the water sector, but I think it'd be very interesting, and I think definitely one of the role of the IWG is to sort of be able to replicate and document, I guess, all those success deals, so that we can scale them up, right? So yeah, I think I'll stop here. There's a few key data resources. You get the infrastructure monitor if you want to sort of see more detailed data on infrastructure investment in general, including social. And then sort of PPI database that's available, and you can see sort of all those deals, all the details. And then the report that I mentioned, the Funding Water Secure Future by the World Bank, very interesting, a lot of data in there. Couldn't sort of give it enough credit, but I think in there you'll see a great assessment on what can be done, the gaps, and what's happening in markets. It's only on sort of emerging markets. It's great effort. So if you're interested in water, definitely a great resource. So on this, obviously, that gives you like an overview of what's happening in the markets, and I'm looking forward to hear from the panel how we can scale those success. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry and Yasmina. Very insightful presentations. We look forward to the release of the paper in 4 weeks' time. So right now we're going to have the panel discussion, and I just want to invite my colleagues. They'll come on stage as I call out their names. First, we have Ken Ose, who's the Principal Investment Officer at the International Finance Corporation. Then we have Kershia Rust, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Affordable Housing Finance Africa. Welcome, Kershia. Then we have Silvestro Lisa from the Ministry of Finance in Italy. And last but not least, we have Yasmina Glichovic, the Head of Grant Operations and New Instruments at the Council of Europe Development Bank. Thank you. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Maybe let me shift my chair so that I can face you and have a conversation. Welcome. Um, can you hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you for joining us on the panel discussion this morning. Look forward to our conversation. Ken, you're sitting right next to me, so I'm going to start with you. So, Ken, IFC's healthcare strategy emphasizes private sector participation. How do you reconcile that with equitable and inclusive infrastructure? Is it possible to have equity and inclusivity when the private sector gets involved in social infrastructure?
Thanks, Anile, and thanks to the organizers for including us in this discussion. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. And the two things are not mutually exclusive, right? So I think the first set of things is uh, healthcare, primary healthcare, and access to good, high quality, affordable healthcare is a key part of the UN SDGs. Right? That said, we also have to come to terms with the fact that governments around the world are fiscally constrained. So there's an opportunity to complement public sector provision and delivery of healthcare through private sector investment in healthcare as well, right? Now, the IFC, we aim to do both. So let me give a very specific example of where the complementarity is really critical. In emerging markets, you'll find increasing incidence of non-communicable diseases. So everything from heart disease, cancers are increasing in terms of two very specific subsets of that. If you look at, say, on the African continent, we're seeing an increase in breast and cervical cancer. At the same time, while these trends are increasing, the need for care is quite critical. Also, these are two diseases that really affect mostly women, primarily women. And women, as you know, are a very significant part of the economic activity and landscape of most countries. So, in treating, almost 50% of the population who will be out of economic activity because of long-term care, you have a direct impact on economics, right? So there's no sort of exclusivity of saying public when the private can deliver. And in a lot of instances, what we find is this overcapacity for the provision of oncology services in the private sector, and yet there's under investment in the public sector. So this is an excellent example where you can combine private and public to achieve social good as well as improve economic activity.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you. And just for Yasmina, so despite the need for social infrastructure, many projects do face barriers to financing. And we saw the presentations that about one quarter or about one fifth or to a quarter in developed markets, MDBs do finance the social infrastructure, but in Africa and some Asian countries, it's far less. What are the barriers to accessing finance, and what, especially in disadvantaged regions such as South Africa and the rest of Africa, what do you, how has the European Development Bank dealt with these challenges in the context of countries with weaker institutional frameworks?
Uh, I think I will build on what our colleague from the IFC said. The first reasons are always competing priorities of the government. So every government has a range of investments ahead of them. They have many priorities. They have a mandate they were given by the public. And I think in that context, we always have discussions whether a road is the priority, a highway is a priority, or is it a school, or is it a hospital? So they're obviously fiscally constrained. Many governments cannot invest as much as they would want to. So this is, I would say, the big reason where we, as I have explained in the presentation, are always trying to demonstrate that investments in social infrastructure are not an expense, that they're also an investment, that you always have to keep in parallel investing in human development, in prevention, in treatment, and housing, um, among other things. So this is something at the level of each government where we always have a discussion. Now, obviously, in every country, there are different levels of development, there are different stages of where the country is economically, and this is always a discussion which is tailored to a specific context. But I think when we talk about barriers to access financing, what we see in practice, and I work in operations, so we work I would say in a relatively more developed part of the world because we are covering European countries. But nevertheless, what we see very often is that governments come with project ideas rather than with projects. So even to attract the private sector, even to have our financing deployed, sometimes it takes years. Sometimes they have a concept note and build a hospital with 500 beds, and then we realize it cannot be done on that land because they didn't do a soil study, because you cannot, I don't know, it's prone to earthquake or there is flooding there. Then they take another year to find another location. Then we realize when we finance education that actually they are not the design which was done for that facility is not in all in line with what this education facility is supposed to provide in terms of services, in terms of functionality, not to talk about universities where they want to do more advanced, for example, educational experiments or whatever they do. The same for housing. Like we go and we want to finance a social housing project, and they say, we have this great idea, we will borrow from you. And then we see that they want to put a certain number of people in a location which is far away, which is not connected with roads, which is not connected with public transportation. And we understand that there are years ahead of us um, from this idea to the project. So your question is your question was what do we do? And I would even dare to say what we advocate for, even in the M degree group, is to have more financing, if possible, grant financing for the preparation, for studies, for needs assessments, to help basically governments. We also work with local communities, not just with central government, but let's say with cities, local communities, to help them, first of all, understand what do they do, why do they do it, what do they need to do. Some of the MBBs have a mandate to help at the strategic level, not to build a random school here or there, to say what are we trying to do as the government, where are we going. We also try to say always when they want to do an investment, are we looking at the regional development, how do you make your country more equally developed in terms of not to have, I don't know, one province which has a GDP twice as high as the other one, because ultimately it's not good, not just for social cohesion, but for the economic development. So we do ask all these questions. We are very hands-on in terms of trying to explain that every day invested in these discussions is worthwhile, because once you start constructing, you cannot go back. And once you employ the private sector in most cases, to build those infrastructural facilities. So we're always trying to really advocate to see whether the needs are evaluated well, whether these are actual real priorities. And then when it comes to the actual construction, we are again hands-on to make sure that they have the cost assessments done well, because sometimes you have projects which start at one estimate and they finish with a double cost, and then they're blocked and the government cannot even finance them further. So we try to invest time to bring technical assistance, to tell them, okay, let's evaluate the costs. Let's see whether this is an optimum facility in terms of climate resilience, weather conditions, flood prevention, energy efficiency, because sometimes you need to invest and then invest even more and more to energy. So to summarize, we're really trying to have a hands-on approach in helping prepare projects, in helping manage them well, and also making sure that we encourage the governments or cities and other stakeholders to think, how will they maintain this infrastructure? What is the cost in 5 years? Do they have budgets for it? So that we make something which is there for several generations.
And can you see me? Okay. Feels like I'm kind of whispery. I just wanted to touch on Silvestro. I think Yasmina mentioned something quite interesting, government. And so private participation of financing infrastructure is key, but government is also a very key player. What do you think is the important role of multilateral development banks? Is it in when working with the state? Is it with the technical financing? Is it providing the concessional financing? In your opinion, where do you think is the important role?
In my opinion, the most important role regards the commitment of governments, the engagement. According to our experience in Italy, all we know that we have budgetary constraints, limited fiscal space. At the same time, all we consider social infrastructure and health infrastructure as a long-term investment rather than a simple expenditure. However, we need money. This is why we need the involvement of the private sector. Uh, our message from my country today is related to the importance of having social infrastructure, health infrastructure, very high on the global agenda. This is very important for us because health is clearly a global public good. This is a key concept for us. And for this reason, no country can tackle the issue alone, as the COVID 19 experience has shown. And this is also why, at national level, you need the public intervention in the field of public good, obviously. Allow me just to recall two or three examples in which my government is strongly committed. Recently, during our G7 presidency in 2024, we promote the funding of Africa Vaccine Manufacturing Accelerator in Africa, a very important instrument to contribute to the development of local production of vaccines. And also back in is very good. And finally, regarding the role of MDBs, I would like to stress that Italy has consistently emphasized the importance of advertising. And in this regard, it's very important this discussion on the policy priorities throughout the negotiations of the multilateral development funds replenishment. And on the basis of this approach, a clear example refers to the ongoing negotiations on the 70 replenishment of the African Development Bank fund, sorry, expect to be completed in next December. I would like to mention that Italy uh, support the inclusion of the health infrastructure in the priorities, which was not initially included. So, thanks to the political engagement of my government, we can confirm that the African Development Fund will continue to focus on health infrastructure. And lastly, in the same vein, allow me to recall that Italy's recently had a pledge worth 100 million euros for the recovery of Ukraine. to prepare the country for the reconstruction as soon as possible, we hope. And the focus was on critical infrastructure such housing, school, and hospitals. And so the key words for us, the key message is that cooperation and coordination is needed given the nature of global public good of the
So, Mr. Kesha, housing is coming up quite often as a form of social infrastructure. I hear Sylvester also mentioned it in response about the rebuilding of Ukraine. How, in policy and investment terms, how can we better integrate housing into the broader social infrastructure agenda?
Thank you, and it's really nice to be here with everybody. Um, I think that the social argument for housing is kind of obvious, and in the context of Ukraine, in the context of any conflict-ridden zone, and then across this continent, and we can look at and express the need that exists and understand that when you've got backlogs that are, you can't even begin to name 19 million units in Nigeria. Then someone said maybe it was 28 million units, and it actually doesn't matter because it is so big, or 2 million or three. There are, what we can see is that the housing sectors across, certainly on this continent, but increasingly globally, are not delivering to the population. And that's critical. And we're now saying that housing is part of social infrastructure because we, as people, as the society that is social, have to be productive in order to participate in economies and growth and so on. And so housing is absolutely needed. The thing with housing is that is a little different from infrastructure in some ways is that its production can be very personal, and that there are ways in which households themselves can express agency. And if we think about the housing sector, not just as its outcome, the social output, the unit that somebody can live in that's adequate, that protects them from the environment, that contributes to their asset base and so on. But think about it as that whole production process. And then we're thinking about land, and we're thinking about infrastructure, and we're thinking about materials and the supply chains that bring sand all the way through to Nairobi, connects it with the cement and connects it with everything else. And then we think about the labor, and some of that labor are people rolling up shirt sleeves and it's manual, and some of it is skilled and technical, in relation, professional skills and so on. And then we think about the finance, and those are all separate economies. And we can say and argue, and we do, that housing has a dramatic impact on the economy. And in the north, it's a key indicator, the impact of housing on the economy. In the global south, less so. We haven't identified a way to articulate that. But we get it. So how do we then turn that into something that actually works? Well, housing has an impact on the economy in the same way the economy has an impact on housing. And the function and the structure of that economy is fundamental to the performance of all of those individuals and companies and institutions and so on. And so the role of the state is not just in the funding of the unit, but in establishing a macroeconomic framework where your interest rates aren't 14.5% plus, right? And we're struggling on this continent to get interest rates lower, to get them below 10%. And in fact, so much of the blended finance investments are about that problem, to bring that down. The second is to create an investment environment where there's domestic capital that's available, because the countries on this continent can't afford American money or European money. It's too risky. And we've seen what happens. And then if they use oil to pay, as Angola, well, then the oil price shifts, and suddenly housing that was supposed to be affordable and the government is invested in is becoming the thing that's dragging that economy down. And so it's really important within the housing sector to recognize those macro things. At the same time, across this continent, perhaps more than in the North, just by nature of where our economies are, individual people are part of the production process in a very profound way. And our financial systems don't seem to get that. And we're missing like a middle layer. So we've got builders who can build 2, 3, 5, 20 units at a time. And if there are a lot of them, that's a lot of houses, right? But we imagine we want to do developments of 5,000, 10,000 units at a time. And the time that takes to organize and to find land that's unencumbered, to make sure that the infrastructure goes into that, all those tiny little developers could have been going and building. The thing that they lack is they lack capital that comes direct, that meets their capacity to engage. They also lack the the technical intersection with infrastructure, and especially now because we've got these crazy urbanization rates, which we haven't seen well globally ever actually, where you have so many people moving into the city. The densities that that's creating means that there's a real health and safety issue here. We have to be careful. People are building up and not necessarily always within the structure of regulations that make sure that that building stands. Um, and so technical capacity there. And I think, so you asked, what is the policy enabler and how do we bring that into infrastructure? I think the first is we recognize the macroeconomic context, and not just around interest rates, that's one example, but it permeates the whole economy. And then secondly, recognize that the deliverers of affordable housing or of social housing, in many cases without subsidies because they haven't worked out how to access the subsidy from the state. And as Yasmina said, the state is so busy with all these other things. The queue to get the housing good is so long, you might as well just do it yourself. So recognize that those actors exist. And some form, when I speak to like BII or FCDO or whatever, they always say, well, that initiative is too small for us. Well, then we need something in the middle to catch the big money and make it possible to go down to the small, more focused needs. And I think that's the real thing that needs to happen. And I do think that housing, this is falling off, that housing is different in that way from other forms of social infrastructure because there are people who can deliver it directly themselves within their communities. And if that can be enabled, you'll have what we've been calling this massive small initiative, where you've got lots of small players whose collective effort is massive, massive, and actually starts to develop. And that doesn't negate some of the large scale programs that governments may want to do, but they're never going to be enough. And you need to have this multi pronged approach. And if our finance system, if the MDB governments recognize that they're not just going to fund the big stuff, but that there's activity that really needs support that works differently than they're currently structured, that would be so helpful.
Silvestro spoke about localization. Silvestro spoke about local production of vaccines as an example. Let us think about utilizing local sources to stimulate the housing market. What does scaling social infrastructure look like in your at the IFC, and how do you ensure that you're working with local players as you're scaling those social infrastructure projects?
So I mean, just building on Yasmina's point, right? So a couple of things that we have to think about. What different types of money are needed at different, to support projects depending on their life cycle. So whether you're building housing, or you're building hospitals or vaccine manufacturing plants, there's an initial period during which they will not generate any commercial output. So the type of money that goes into it at that stage cannot be debt because nobody can repay you from no cash flows. in terms of mobilizing local funding, in addition to, I think, MDBs, we have to look into things like local pension funds. This is patient money. I mean, got to be careful because people's retirements are at stake and that sort of thing. But presumably, they have a longer runway to generate funds. So during that patient period, one has to mobilize local funding. The other category I think we often overlook is the insurance industry. Right? Life insurance, for example, is insurance. People put it away, they contribute policy, premiums, and at a different date, either they or their progeny benefit from it. So those are examples. I think a key issue is really mobilizing and aggregating and pooling funding. And that's something that we've done, for instance, working on vaccine front, right, where the different types of funding, grant funding, donor funding, you have government funding through different institutions, you have private capital, so pension funds, but mobilizing and aggregating and pooling it together to deploy it is something that I think we need to do more of. We're starting to do that at the IFC in projects we're involved with. The last area is, and I think perhaps Yasmina touched on this on her presentation, social bonds. So when we get to the early part, has to be some sort of equity-like investment, patient money. When it gets to the stage where the project can now start repaying, using instruments, debt instruments that have a social impact or a social bond, and can also aggregate grant funding to help bring down the cost of funding. And this is something that can be done across housing, other social sectors, where you're pooling together different types of capital. I think ultimately you were talking about local funding, right? So local funding has to come from the communities or countries that ultimately benefit from the immediate. One last area, because you asked, is vaccines and pharmaceuticals. I mean, this is an area where you need basically intellectual property. So government promoting more local IP patents that can be monetized for the benefit of achieving large scale commercialization. And it could be everything from building materials. I mean, sometimes we have some of the most inventive people using different building materials for panels, for insulation. And these are all areas that we should actively, more proactively pursue and incorporate into sort of the investment cycle. So it's not just sort of a one or the other. The MDBs will never have enough money. Governments will never have enough money. The private sector is not being adequately mobilized. So whether it's venture capitalists, corporates, private equity funds, their money needs to be brought into the picture.
Thanks, Kim. And Yasmina, I've sat in asset allocation meetings, and there's always um, a competition for funding. So asset managers, they would view social infrastructure as providing less returns compared to other infrastructure like telecommunications or energy. What would be your argument if you were in that room, and how does it say balance developmental developmental mandate with returns?
That's a very interesting question. I would like to approach it, if you don't mind, a little bit differently. And first of all, we have evidence because we are issuing social bonds that there is investment and there is interest in investing in social, and the CB and others, not just the CB, other multilateral banks are very successful in basically attracting those investors who want not just to maximize profits, but to invest something which is meaningful. But, and but comes here, the reason why we have such high uptake is because there are very clear principles behind, because there is a lot of clarity and transparency on what actually our investments are and what we actually finance and what our portfolio is. Now, moving to to project financing, or where we need to, as you say, pool funds, Kesha, to basically have it at scale for many small investors and investments to happen. I think at that level, we need to. The reality is that even if we look at impact investors or social responsible investors, so those who do not necessarily maximize profit, so they're looking at the double bottom line or triple bottom line. So they're looking at not just financial return, but they're looking at social return, they're looking at the environmental return. The problem is that only around 30% of impact investments worldwide, around 150 billion in 2023, was for social infrastructure, including housing, which was more than others, but also health and very little education. And the reasons behind that are not because of the financial returns only, it's because we do not have a clear framework on what social is. There were some attempts to develop a taxonomy, a classification, to have one or two key indicators, to have very clear reporting frameworks. But we, as a global community of MDPs, of different think tanks, we're not there yet. It is a difficult thing to do because social projects are complex. They require and sometimes include multiple objectives. Sometimes we don't talk about one sector, so it's not that straightforward. But the fact is that even among the impact investors and social responsible investors, who not necessarily seek to maximize profit. Of course, they want returns on their investments, but we're not talking about very high returns or maximizing returns. We're talking about, in many cases, those who want to diversify their portfolio in different assets, in different investments. And also sometimes they have retail investors or pension funds behind who care actually about not just negative screening, but also positively impacting their funds, those who are basically the recipients of the services or investments which are following those funds. So in this part, as I said, only one third is going to social infrastructure. And I think the question is, what can we do? What do we do? The question is difficult, but we, as the MDBs and other parts of our community, we have seen some success in, for example, climate finance, when we join forces and we try to come out with clear indicators, with clear frameworks that can actually help mobilize more private investments. We hope to do the same in the area of social investment. But the challenges which were mentioned by all of us at the country level are still there in many cases. And what the private investors are always looking for is predictability, is clear regulatory framework. It's not maybe the ability to maximize funds, but to be able to actually analyze risks and to be able to analyze their cash flows, to be able to have meaningful projections, which means that the environment where they invest and what the governments can do to create such an environment remain something which needs to be the final part of this investment puzzle. So to summarize, I think that it's good to talk about financial returns, but more than anything, it's good to talk about how do we create at the country level an environment which is predictable and which is good to attract investors, but also what do we as a community, as MDBs can do to help create more transparency, to create a simple framework, simply indicators which will help those investors who want to invest come and be able to see whether their impact is real and to track it over time.
Thank you. Kisha, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said because I think what's so critical in a place where capacity support would be really welcome, both in the public sector and in the private sector, is how to collect the data that the investors want. And certainly within the public sector, we've worked with national bureaus of statistics, and they are such important bedrocks of so many of the economies on this continent. But they lack the capacity to, or do not have the connection to what it is the investor wants to know and how to direct that in an appropriate way around specific sectors. And then the private sector as well, that busy doing their work and they're
Yeah.
not collecting their data. So the regulators could take that data and they could publish it. And there is such an opportunity for that. You mentioned it as well. We're working in these opaque environments. It's very difficult for investors to assess both the risk but also the opportunity, in which case then social is dominant and they're missing out on actually what the opportunity is for working with this massive underserved population.
And then just Silvestro, I mean, as you may know, South Africa is at its very early stages of its national health insurance scheme. Europe and in particular Italy, you've got a national health care scheme and also a very active private sector participation in financing healthcare and other forms of infrastructure. But I just want to focus on healthcare for this question. How do you maintain that right balance? And what advice do you give to countries like South Africa and other emerging countries that are in the beginning stages of financing and rolling out a national health insurance program?
Um, okay. In Europe, we basically have two systems according to the funding. Our system is financed by general taxation. And so our system is based on the principle of universality. This is very important. Equity, very much in line with the priorities of the G20 presidency. Uh, the balance between the private and public sector is in our case based on a strong public foundation because the health the national system is essential to supply care to all citizens regardless of the income or of the social status. It's very important for low-level income countries of Africa. The second point is it's very important a very well-regulated private sector because the involvement of the private sector should work in a good environment, in a regulatory framework with data and so on. We have a system of accredited private entities which can deliver the services, and after that they will receive the reimbursement, the refund from the national system. Third point is the PPP, the private public partnership, obviously, especially in the areas like research or digital health. It's also important for a country like Italy, but I think also for big countries, have a central system, but we should have also a decentralized system to manage the governance. And our system it's based mainly on the prevention and on the primary care. So Italy's experience with pros and cons, with the budgetary constraints that all we have, as showed during the COVID-19 crisis, responded quite well to the shock of the pandemic.
Kesha, Silvestro mentioned triple Ps in housing. Can you give us examples of where triple Ps have the greatest potential to make a meaningful impact?
I think I'll step away from the word that is PPP and just think of when the public and the private sector work in partnership with one another, because sometimes one gets tangled up in the existing legislation. And what is it? The public sector is good at doing certain things and they have certain assets and resources, and the private sector is good at doing other things and they have to come together and make something work in a context. So in looking at different examples, and I'll share one, but that's the bottom line, is that everyone does what they're good at and they bring those resources to the table and they make sure that the risk feared by the one is managed by the other. and so on, right? And bring that, because they're both looking in the direction of housing. We've just done a piece of research together with Convergence, and we're launching it next month in Kenya, looking at examples of blended finance in affordable housing in Africa. There weren't so many official ones, and some of the ones we looked at, the real thing that made them trip up was a misunderstanding around that. And then the legal agreements that went into the detail of trying to understand the difference between an American financial system and a French, the system of the French monetary union, and so on. So, using foreign capital, bad idea, really bad idea when you've got long time frames and currencies can move a lot. So I think local becomes the most important in terms of that kind of a relationship between public-private sector. In this country, in South Africa, there's an institution that was started over, I think it was 21, 22 years ago, called TUF. TUF is a mortgage lender. They provide finance to landlords of inner city rental buildings.
And TAF is the Trust for Urban Housing Finance.
They've sort of put those words away now because they're no longer a trust, because they're now a PTY limited. So now TUF has become a word itself. But what they do, they started based on an American model, actually, the Shore Bank model in South Shore of Chicago, where it was recognized that all these buildings were derelict and not being invested in, but they were occupied by people. And so Shore Bank looked for the leaders in those communities, offered them capital and training to improve the dwellings, and then they created resident landlords. So TUF does the same sort of thing and has done it in inner city of Johannesburg. They were originally funded with, they had money that came from the city of Johannesburg, from the Inner City Housing Upgrading Trust, and then they got money from the National Housing Finance Corporation, which is a state-owned entity in South Africa. And then over the course of their 20 years, they started to get other money coming in. That's interesting, and we've written a case study about that. But then what they did is they targeted these entrepreneurs who hadn't done it before, but had a certain, I don't know, a talent at being a leader. So across their whole loan book, and they've got a loan book of right now 3.9 billion Rand, 46% of loans are going to starter borrowers, as in they only have one property and that property is less than 5 million Rand. 41% going to emerging, so they've got a bit more than one property and more than 5 million Rand. And then 13%, only 13% are going to established landlords who have portfolios worth more than 30 million Rand. They've delivered 53,440 loans, and in this past year, they've had 668 clients. So these are tiny projects. And one way they enabled, it's an interesting PPP because it's taking, and maybe I'm stretching the term a bit, but it's taking public money, mixing it with private money inside the institution, and then they created, because regular people often don't have equity, and especially if you're poor, right? So someone wants to become a landlord and doesn't have the equity to put down to get a loan. Well, they created something called the Instituto Equity Fund. And what that is a structure that's taken money from a range of sources on a concessional basis, and it provides mezzanine finance, a loan, 15%, maximum 15% of the loan value, which then is coupled with 5% equity from the borrower to get an 80% loan to value loan. And it's empowerment financing that's now starting to improve the quality of inner city Johannesburg and Cape Town and Port Elizabeth and so on all over. They've done much more than that. But so the PPP part, public money came in together with private money. I would call the individual borrowers also part of the private sector because they're individuals, but they're private and they're investors, they're investing. They're engaging with the city in terms of city improvement districts and building up the quality of the urban infrastructure and so on. So it's not one project. It's a way of working, a way of engaging, structured around a series of agreements that take into account who the actors are in place. And I mean, I hope that's a fair answer to your question because I think that oftentimes the PPPs that we look at and we sigh is because they try to do so much in this one thing wrapped up with a ribbon and something didn't work and so the whole thing failed. And so if you could find you want to have an approach of engaging, bringing public and private together in a whole series of, of coordinated interventions under a theme. For me, that's the way you make a PPP, so called, actually work.
I think also what I find commendable is the structure that's been put in place with the social housing regulatory agency, SHRA, with providing the two-thirds capital grant alongside the one-third that comes from private sector, because that has enabled the rollout of housing in low-income areas. Maybe do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, South Africa has a social housing subsidy, which it started with democracy, basically, to invest, to provide the delivery of social rental housing. And social housing institutions would be created, were created, that then received that money. And over the years, that system has evolved so that now part of the grant is a restructuring grant that changes it's place based. It's to secure well located land as well, so that you can bring lower income people into areas that are traditionally higher value land, and so on. So that funding is useful, but I would say that tough clients don't access that subsidy, and yet they're serving the same target market. And so the thing that we have to be, I think, most careful about when we think about where to invest government and certainly MDB money as well is that we don't want to invest it in subsidizing inefficiencies. We want to invest it in enabling good practice. And so I think our frontier around the social housing subsidy is to have that connect more productively with the kind of work that the entrepreneurs are doing through the tough and the almost family model.
Earlier on, Henry's presentation touched on government guarantees. Ken, how do we structure our social housing initiatives so they don't depend on government guarantees? The government only has, its balance sheet with its own limitations. How do we stop the over reliance, or maybe limit the over reliance on state guarantees?
I'll say with difficulty, with great difficulty. So I think, but not to be tongue. I think we need to also look within the G20 for best practices. Right? So we have to look within the G20 around the world and see what has been done elsewhere that has actually been successful. Um, Earlier on, Henri was talking about, we were talking about Singapore and saying, okay, maybe a generation ago, Singapore would have been a perfect example. Or maybe we should need to go back and say, 50 years ago, what was done? What was the vision? How was it created? And how do we create that now or an equivalent? It doesn't have to be a carbon copy, but some equivalent. I think the other issue is, in addition to guarantees, is this whole idea of pooling and mobilizing. Uh, as Jasmina said early on, and Sylvester, I mean, there are a lot of countries around the world that are willing and interested in supporting individuals who will be willing to contribute, I don't know, 10 Rand a month or a year. We're not pooling any of that money. So that money is sitting on the sidelines. Nobody's harnessing it. So if we can find a way to create just sort of interested parties who say, I want to support housing in South Africa, where would I go put my money? And I'm not a big bank or whatever. There's got to be a vehicle to do things like that then can be going alongside the big institutions to create part of the guarantee pool. So I think what I'm saying is an over reliance on sort of large institutions, which by their virtual definition move in a certain way, but we're not maybe adequately tapping the opportunities that will create a bigger scale. And then those institutions can then help deploy. And I think that will help sort of increase the guarantee. Government's ability will always be constrained because they have to prioritize amongst many things. But we shouldn't really even expect that of governments to say more education, more housing, more healthcare. It's simply not, especially where there's other resources sitting on the sidelines. So I think this whole issue of pooling, aggregating, and then playing a role of sort of distributing is another way to sort of expand the guarantee pool.
So we're going to wrap up our panel discussion. And Yasmina, we've learned a lot from you today. I want to give you an opportunity to express lessons learned in your journey as the SEB in financing social infrastructure.
Well, first of all, we would like to acknowledge, first of all, thank you, Zenel, and all the panelists and colleagues who are here. Uh, our objective this year was, as I said in the presentation, to raise awareness that we need education, that we shouldn't take health for granted, that we need to invest more, and that we cannot ignore the fact that the housing is becoming an issue even in more developed economies, and not to speak about less developed countries where it's actually a burning issue. We wanted to use this year as an opportunity to engage, as an opportunity also to raise this awareness among our peers. For us, it's our only mandate. It's the only thing that we do, but we wanted to say to others who are working in this group that we should put back social on the agenda. And on the other hand, we were positively surprised to see how many of them are actually putting it back on the agenda, or more strongly on the agenda. Uh, I would say that one of the takeaways from this discussion, we talked about health, we talked about education, but somehow I would say, talked about housing a lot because we are in a country where housing is needed, in a continent where the housing is a burning issue. I think that going forward, what is very obvious to us working also in Europe is that innovation will be needed not just on the financing side, uh, but also at the level of the actual technical solutions to provide more affordable housing solutions. Costs have skyrocketed in some countries. Even the middle class cannot afford to buy an apartment. And I think here the innovation must come from not the government, but the private sector as well. We hear a lot about AI, we hear a lot about technological advancements, and we as a CEB have been working, for example, with Ukraine, with Ukrainian government also to see how do they find a solution for so many internally displaced people, like millions of them, and provide solutions which are affordable, but also that we can do at scale and in a relatively short amount of time. I think that there are some promising ideas, promising pilots, but we, I think, as a group, as the MDBs, and we as the CEB, definitely are there to, as you said, to identify what works, to spread the word, and to see what were the conditions for that concrete case to work and how can we apply it in different contexts. And the final words for me is not a lesson, but it's a big thank you to our hosts, to South Africa, to our colleagues who have been working with us to prepare this panel, those working in the Infrastructure Working Group, to our colleagues Boitumelo, Veron, and others who actually recognize the importance of this topic, not only today, but also during the past several months, where they actually joined these discussions together with the Development Bank of South Africa and contributed to putting social on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Silvestro, we have some government representatives in the audience from the Italian Ministry of Finance and in particular working for the G20 and G7 office. Any parting words?
Yes, the focus of my country is on the need to preserve what has been done so far, and to draw the attention of governments and financing institutions on health infrastructure and on social infrastructure in general. We want to leverage what has been produced, and in this context, in our view, it's very important the G20 joint financial task force. It is of paramount importance for us. For example, last week during the meeting of this task force, all G20 members confirmed the value of the task force as a unique forum which effectively bridge health and finance ministers to to stress the importance of their deliverables. So Italy remains strongly committed in the year ahead and also in the longer term to ensuring the continuity of this task force. This is very important, and our goal is to keep this forum active and fully engaged in advancing the discussion on these important topics such as health infrastructure and social infrastructure. Thank you.
And Kesha, I probably have never said this to you, but I've been a consumer of your research.
It's
um,
nice.
I have used it a lot in my investments in affordable and social housing. So thank you for the excellent work. I'm sure you're working on very interesting things on the continent. Any parting words for the audience?
Really, just to say thank you for the discussion and the real opportunity for bringing together this a discussion between public, private, civil, um, because I think we all have things to contribute. CAF is the secretariat to an organization called the African Union for Housing Finance. It's a member-based industry body which represents 70 members across 23 countries, and we're growing. And the private sector is working really, is very interested in providing its voice and engaging with government to find where the opportunity is. So that we look at this as this is the fastest growing, right? We've got lots of growth, we've got lots of movement in urban areas, and there's huge demand. So there's, if we can figure out how to crack it, there's a really nice future ahead, I think, that's worth engaging with. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Ken, I have tremendous respect for you. I've worked with you on few projects across education, student housing, and healthcare. I think you're not talking theoretical stuff here. You really do bring together pension funds, asset managers, MDBs, and government together. Any words from you?
So that's a nice way of saying we've lost money together in investments, but we've also made money together. So I think in terms of, I think the first thing I'd like to say is the concepts of social and commercial are not mutually exclusive, right? So we need to have social infrastructure in order to be able to deliver public goods. But they also provide a platform for jobs. I mean, you know, the other thing we need to really sort of recognize is that in parts of the world, emerging markets where social infrastructure is missing, presents a huge opportunity for other parts. So it's not all a terrible thing. It's a great opportunity for folks to actually for us to encourage others to say, well, the X million houses that are not existing represent a massive opportunity for somebody else to come into the market. Uh, I think the third thing I'd like to say is governments should not see themselves as sort of the problem solver, but simply to create the space for others to solve the problem. Because sometimes governments inadvertently, I don't want to say block, but inadvertently are not where they're best positioned. Because once you create the framework, others will come and solve the problem. The last thing I'd like to say is this whole issue of pooling and aggregation. There's money all over sitting on the sidelines, and we have to find a way to bring it together to solve these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
to, please sit down.
Oops.
I'm going to hand over to Mbali if she's still around, but if she's not around, I think we just wanted to give the audience a chance to interact with the panelists. If you want to ask a question, please, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for South African presidency for organizing this event and again for humor, for your humor. And thank you. And everyone knows that many countries are facing with um, uh, challenge how to channel private capital in social projects with low commercial returns but significant public benefits. For example, in Russia, the pilot program Social Impact Project CIP, implemented with the support of FreeIB RF, introduces an innovative results-driven approach to public service delivery. Under this model, private investors fund social initiatives such as employment programs for vulnerable groups or preventive healthcare, while the government pays only upon verified achievement of predefined social outcomes assessed independently. Since 2019, 13 CIPs have been launched across 9 regions, reaching 40,000 beneficiaries. As a form of blended finance and impact investing, it aligns with international best practices and offers a replicable framework for government seeking to improve social infrastructure through evidence-based risk partnerships. And given this experience, I would like to ask the panel what conditions are needed for such mechanisms to become widespread in countries with varying levels of fiscal maturity and development of this private sector. And how can MTBs help create these conditions, for example, through technical support, standardization of metrics, and modernization of legal frameworks? Thank you.
Um, Yasmina, would you like to take that?
Sure. I mean, I'm not very familiar with the model to be able to say how we could replicate the model that you talked about. I'm happy to look at it later. But I think, in principle, and to maybe build on what we were talking about when you say it's about pooling funds, I think it's also about pooling funds for technical assistance and support. And we do have some regional initiatives among the MDBs. For example, in Europe, the European Union is actually supporting technical assistance facilities, which help tremendously the governments prepare projects. And I think this is probably the key added value of all of us jointly as MDBs and the European Union. But it doesn't have to be the European Union, it can be in other parts of the world as well. It can be MDBs also putting funds together. And the way it works is that we basically come up with a joint pipeline. The countries make joint pipelines of projects that we screen and we look at together. And very often we make decisions on how to support them. And we're talking about major investments. This is not only for social infra, but it's for all infrastructure. But very often we join forces, we add financing to it, and to be able to qualify for such support, every initiative has to have a strategic and a strategic framing around it. It has to have a long-term view in terms of where you want to go with it. It has to fit within the national priorities, and it has to have support from different stakeholders in the country. So I think joining funds and pooling funds together. The IFC is also part of it, for example, for Western Balkans, but it can be applied for other regions. I think that can be a way to prepare, but also replicate what works. Because very often when we debate and when we look at jointly the projects at such an early stage, then we also reflect on what we did before, because it's been 20 years we are part of these facilities, and the learning is also there. So in this concrete case, I think what you described looked like a very good initiative. But what in terms of what MDBs can do together, I would say to do even more in joining forces in pooling funds and creating developing these facilities, not just in Europe, but also in other parts of the world.
Thank There's a question at the front. Two questions. I think this will be our last two questions, and then we can end goal for tea time.
Thanks so much, Ramesh Subramaniam from the Coalition for Disaster Related Infrastructure. Not a question, but a comment. The need to focus on, when we are looking at social infrastructure or physical infrastructure, the need to focus on how to make them resilient to disasters. Last week, closer to home here in South Africa, last week we released a report at the Africa Climate Summit. As we know, needs are large, unmet needs in infrastructure, very large in the continent, close to 70, $80 billion. But our assessment indicates that disasters cost another additional $13 billion every year. And out of this 13 billion, bulk of it comes in housing and buildings. So it's not just resilient to disasters, but also making these assets broadly resilient overall. So we are working with member countries as well as international organizations. The five examples, Jasmina, that you pointed out in your slide, they are among many, but I think we need a lot more. For example, India, under the G20 presidency a couple of years ago, launched a climate and health initiative to boost resilience in the health sector. We need several such initiatives. Thank you so much for the great discussion. Henry and Yasmin, great presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman at the front, she's right here.
Thank you very much for the insightful session. I've got a question for Ken in terms of the pooling and aggregation strategy. Do you have the practical, like, I know we were talking about social infrastructure, but do you have success stories in other sectors like energy, transport, and so on that you can share with us? Thank
I have one, but it's not energy and transport, so you'll have to forgive me. But we've done one that actually involves, European Union in a very significant way. Sylvester mentioned the African vaccine, AVMA, African Vaccine Accelerator. So a few years ago, I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, right, it was no secret that a lot of countries said, well, how can we manufacture vaccines? And what was happening was, frankly, lots of companies, lots of investors, lots of MDBs, all wanting to play a contributing role. So what we actually did is that we created we called it a consortium. It was a consortium of like-minded institutions, all of whom had different financing capabilities. So we literally organized them. Uh, so first of all, the size of the problem actually became smaller because if you say you're going to do a $250 million project across 8 institutions, suddenly the arithmetic just completely organized. The other thing we discovered through the coordination is that some institutions could only provide grant funding, some could do grant funding and debt funding. Some could do equity funding, nothing else. But by organizing this consortium and determining what each institution could do, um, the client was then able to be supported with things like feasibility studies, which were paid for with the grant funding. Then the idea was once they got to the point where they could determine what was feasible, what could be manufactured, or what the need was, then it moved to sort of the equity investors would then come in. Because you could only lend to them once the project reaches a stage. But then the lenders are at the table at the very beginning. So this is a case where the organization and the coordination is all done up front by aggregating it. It is not easy because you have competing institutions. There's also, we learned a term, there's a fear of missing out. Nobody wants to miss out. So everybody wants to be at the table. And that itself creates sort of a natural tension. Now, there's no reason why something like that could not be applied in other sectors. Of course, with the peculiarities of each sector to be thought.
Thank you. Our panelists will be available at tea time, so if you want to have a short conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Really, thank you. Well done. It was very nicely done. That's what I
Christina,
said.
thank you. That was very good.